Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I'm here with Dr. Gabriel Reynolds. He has a PhD from Yale and is a professor in theology at the University of Notre Dame. His research specifically focuses on the Quran and early Islamic studies. And he's also the host of the YouTube channel Exploring the Quran in the Bible, which I would highly recommend. I've found that a very interesting YouTube channel over the years, and I've learned a lot from it. And so I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Thank you, Sam. Very glad to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. And I look forward to exchanging ideas about Christology, Islam, the Quran, Christianity, all of that.
Perfect. So I'm a little bit interested in your personal story. What was sort of your faith background, and how did you get interested in this particular subject?
I think my personal story is less exciting than maybe people might assume or hope for. I was raised in the suburbs in the Northeast in Connecticut. In some ways, typical kind of family background for that time and place. Born in the 70s. I had one parent who was a non-practicing, from a Protestant background, non-practicing. Another parent who at the time was, kind of in between New Age and Catholicism. So that was kind of there. Most of my friends, I went to public school, were somewhere between like not religious at all towards, sort of lukewarm. There wasn't a lot of religion around. Now, the one interesting thing about my family background is that on my mother's side, and this is where the middle name Said comes from, my family originally is from Syria. And so like that was there. They were all Christians. They were actually Eastern Orthodox Christians on my mother's side. No one was really practicing Eastern Orthodoxy on that side of the family anymore. It had been generations since kind of the first members of that family, the Laham family, had come to Boston. And so, but that kind of planted the seed in my brain of interest in the Middle East generally. And then later on, when I went to college, I had a chance to study abroad, and I went to Jordan. And in fact, that first summer when I was in Jordan, I also took a weekend trip to Damascus, Syria. And that whole experience was kind of transformative, just discovering Arabic in the Middle East.
So how did you get interested in studying the Quran and Islamic origins and those sorts of topics?
I think there's one or two steps that got me eventually to Quranic studies. The first step was general interest in religion, which was connected in part towards kind of the intense religious back and forth at Columbia University, where I was an undergrad in New York. It's just really dynamic. It may not be too interesting to your audience, Sam, so I won't go into detail, but, lots of people of different religions anywhere in New York. So I became interested in religion generally when I was at Columbia, but then traveling during my time there in the summers to the Middle East a couple of times and discovering, how religious Muslims, at least in the Arab world, often are. Obviously not all of them, but religion just everywhere, dominates society, honor, shame things, public ways. You have loudspeakers on every mosque in the Arab world, not only for the call to prayer, but for the Friday sermon, for Quran recitation. Just kind of discovering that was like, really intense experience. So it's kind of the first step. And then the second step was a little bit more intellectual. So especially through kind of debates going on in the latter half of my graduate studies. I was back in Connecticut then. There was a book published in the year 2000 in German, which had this radical new thesis about the Quran. Most people haven't followed that thesis, but it started a really kind of intense debate and some polemics about the Quran. And that sort of attracted my attention to Quranic studies. And even though my dissertation, so my graduate work, was not in Quranic studies, as I was kind of wrapping that up, I was already kind of being drawn towards that field and basically never looked back. I did publish the dissertation, which was not in Quranic, was in Islamic studies, but not Quranic studies. But most of my work since then has been on the Quran.
And last personal question, what inspired you to start a YouTube channel about these topics?
I think it was I mean, just kind of this vague, creeping sense. So, I've been really blessed to have this great position at Notre Dame. I don't take that for granted for one instant. There are smarter and better scholars than me that didn't have the fortune to land a job like that. So, that's just been really a blessing to me. It's 22, 23 years that I'm at Notre Dame. Community is great. Students are great. Colleagues, terrific. I've had great chairs of my department, beginning with John Cavadini. So I just felt like, a lot of blessing and good fortune has come my way. And, I advanced through different stages of promotion and all of that with various people supporting me. And at a certain point, I was like, I need to start doing more public education. Not that I'm the source of illumination for the whole world, but I just felt like, I've done kind of the technical stuff for a small handful of academics, and I need to do more public education. And also observing my own children as they grew older, and just becoming aware that people are sort of getting content on religion more from video stuff online, YouTube and otherwise, than they are from reading books, even popular books. I mean, young people now are principally engaging with religion and other topics online. So yeah, it seemed like the right thing to do.
All right. Well, that sounds great, and I appreciate the fact that you've done that. I've learned a lot from your channel and your various interviews on other people's channels. I do feel like YouTube, YouTube and other online platforms are providing chronic online learners an infinite opportunity to find stuff that they're interested in. So
yeah, and I'm also a learner. I mean, I love. Sometimes the algorithm's frustrating because you're like, can I escape the whoever's manipulating this and forming my brain? But sometimes it's great because you just discover this new content in related fields. So yeah, I'm on YouTube a lot, just learning from others.
Great. So now the first question I wanted to ask you sort of about the main topics of this video is trying to understand the religious context that was in Arabia at the time of sort of the formative years of the life of Muhammad and the beginnings of the Quran and the Islamic community. And the main topic that I'm curious in is, how did the Quran and Muhammad come to have the Christology that he has, the views of Jesus that he had, and what does that say about the influences on him and the context of Christianity in the time, but how much maybe was original to him, and exactly where is the balance between those two sorts of things? So I think the first question is what was the religious climate like and context like? I know that's an enormous question at some level, but what was the context like that we can infer that was influencing Muhammad as he was growing up?
Right. Yeah. Terrific question. It is a big question. So maybe I'll start with the answer. Feel free to interrupt me, Sam. If I start droning on, because there are a lot of factors, a lot of things to keep sort of in mind in assessing the question, and kind of also sort of hovering above any sort of description of the religious context when Islam emerges is a debate among scholars, particularly about the extent to which Christianity was present in the interior of the Arabian Peninsula, and there are really different positions on that. So try to give sort of a general description, and then maybe assess the debate a little bit. In terms of chronology, the traditional date of Muhammad's birth is AD 570. Traditional date of his first proclamation, or at least reception of the Quranic revelation, is AD 610. So we're about 600 years after the life of Christ. In terms of geography, we're south of Palestine, where Christ was, of course. We're in the western part of what is now Saudi Arabia, in a region which is classically known as the Hijaz. And of course, Muhammad's, the traditional site of his birth, in the beginning of his proclamation or proclamations as a prophet, is the city of Mecca, which of course today is the holiest city for Muslims, the direction in which Muslims pray, and the city to which Muslims go on pilgrimage, on the Hajj. So we're dealing with sort of 610 Mecca. Now, in terms of Christianity, I mean, maybe a good place to begin is the traditional idea that more or less, Mecca was a pagan island in a Christian sea of the late antique Near East. So you kind of go in any direction, you'll bump into a Christian civilization or culture, right? So you go to the north to Palestine and Syria, Christianity. If you go to the west to Egypt, Christianity. If you go to the southwest across the Red Sea, more southwesterly to Ethiopia, Christianity. Even if you go due south in the Arabian Peninsula to what is now Yemen and even the southern part of Saudi Arabia, for example, the city of Najran, Christianity. If you go east, in fact, the western coast of the Persian Gulf, so where the United Arab Emirates are today, Qatar, Bahrain, all of that was heavily Christian. And even if you go to the northeast, what is now Iraq, or even much of Iran, yes, there was Zoroastrianism, but much of Iran was Christians. Christianity everywhere. But the traditional idea, not only among Muslims, but also among, say, the early Orientalists, sort of kind of the great scholars of the 19th, early 20th century, is that Christianity had not penetrated into the Hejaz. So Mecca was basically a purely pagan city, was kind of the last outpost of some sort of crass, idolatrous, polytheistic paganism with many gods and idols, and maybe every tribe had their own god, or maybe individual tribes had many gods. In any case, the Kaaba, the central shrine, the building which is clothed in a black cloth, so it looks black, although it's not actually black, the center of Muslim pilgrimage and the direction of Muslim prayer, the Kaaba had become this house of idols. So, and then the debate is increasingly there are signs, both through a careful reconsideration of historical sources and the evidence of Arabic language inscriptions that have been found, that in fact Christianity had penetrated into the interior of Arabia. It's quite possible that there were not just individual Christians passing through Mecca, but that actually there were Christian communities in Mecca and Medina, the second city. I could go on and speak a little bit about the kinds of Christianity that were there, because obviously there are different sorts, communities of Christians. I don't know if that's a good next step.
Yeah, so I've heard you talk about kind of a monotheistic transformation of Arabia in the century or so before leading up to the time of Muhammad. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and various sort of inscriptions and Proto-Arabic and stuff like that?
Oh, terrific. Yeah, great. So this is a very important and very astute, Sam, for you to note the importance of this sort of revolution before the revolution of Islam. So this is something rather stunning that we find in the evidence of rock inscriptions in Arabia, which is around the year 500, the reference to pagan gods in these rock inscriptions, so Arabic language rock inscriptions throughout the Arabian Peninsula, including the Hejaz, the reference to the pagan gods around the year AD 500, those references completely disappear. They're just gone. And at the same time, there's a change in a script. So before 500, AD 500, I'm speaking about the northern area. The south of the Arabian Peninsula is kind of a different story. We don't have to worry too much about that right now. But before 500, we have a whole sort of variety of different scripts. And we're just speaking about the alphabet, the writing system, that are used to write Arabic languages or Arabic dialects. So, but the year 500, we begin to see inscriptions. In fact, we only see inscriptions thereafter in basically the what we now know as the Arabic script. So the Proto-Arabic script it's usually called Paleo-Arabic, is the more accepted or hip term to use. So this revolution has two aspects. One is the disappearance of polytheistic inscriptions and the appearance of monotheistic inscriptions. And then the other aspect is just with the script, the early Arabian scripts, of which there are many in the northern zone, they all disappear. Instead, we have this Paleo-Arabic script, which clearly develops into the script in which the Quran and subsequent Arabic literature is written in.
And so what kind of monotheism is this? Is this evidence of sort of a Christian evangelization of the finally coming to the area? Is this Jewish influenced? Is this just some sort of non-specific Abrahamic monotheism? What exactly is this religious transformation?
It's above all Christian, Sam. It's above
Yeah.
all Christian. Ahmad Al-Jallad, the great scholar at Ohio State University, and we're recording this on the day that Notre Dame is going to be playing Ohio State, so it's kind of hard for me to throw a lot of love on a Ohio State professor today. But nevertheless, the great Ohio State professor Ahmad Al-Jallad has this nice line in which he says, these Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, so these monotheistic inscriptions that begin to appear in the year 500 up to the origin of Islam, every Paleo-Arabic inscription we found is monotheistic, and every Paleo-Arabic inscription that can be identified further has been identified as Christian. Mm-hmm. So, because it could be ambiguous, you could just have a reference to God. Usually these inscriptions don't use, I mean, it's hard to read them because there's no vowels, but from the consonantal skeleton, they don't seem to refer to God as Allah. They refer to him in a slightly different way, which is El-Ilah in Arabic, which simply means the God. So it's like Greek ho theos, so the God. It could actually be a kind of what people call a calque on the Greek. So yeah, I mean, so they're all monotheistic, and none. And now it's a little bit more difficult to pinpoint a Jewish inscription because Christians have a cross, and they like to put the cross in their rock inscriptions when Jews don't really have a corresponding symbol. But I mean, it's not compelling evidence, maybe, but the suggestion of the evidence is that likely all of these inscriptions are Christian. If it doesn't have a cross and it just mentions El-Ilah, it's possible that it's Jewish. To me, it's not very likely that there was anything like vague Abrahamic monotheist, neither Jewish nor Christian. That is an idea that's out there. I don't really buy into that. So yeah, I think these inscriptions are evidence, exactly as you said, Sam, of the progressive evangelization of the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. Starting around the year 500, or almost seemingly like almost having completed by the year 500.
Yeah, exactly. So definitely started earlier. So like one kind of interesting data point that's not from the inscriptions is around the year AD 518. Someone may correct me on the date in the comments here, but there's a letter written by a Syriac bishop. His name is Jacob of Serugh. So he's a bishop way up in what is now Turkey in Anatolia. But he writes a letter to the established Christian community in South Arabia. It's known as the letter to the Himyarites. And now the letter he wrote was in Syriac, not in Arabic. But so that suggests that that at least in South Arabia, there wouldn't have been Arameans. Those South Arabians would have been Arabs who simply used Syriac as their religious language. So yeah, I mean, the evangelization started quite early. Some of the inscriptions are earlier than 500, but right, as you said, yeah, significant progress had taken place by the year 500.
Yeah, gotcha. So now the follow-up question is, what kind of Christianity or various kinds of Christianity is this, or are there? Is this just, kind of run-of-the-mill Eastern Orthodoxy or Syriac Orthodoxy spreading down that would it be, I mean, well, even then that brings up the question, are they Nestorian? Are they Coptic? Right. Are they just sort of, kind of relatively in communion with Constantinople? Or is Arabia sort of the refuge of the heretics who have gotten, persecuted and kicked out of mainstream Orthodox Christian churches and more well controlled by the empire places? What is that? What forms of Christianity are there swirling around at the time?
Yeah, terrific question. So there's probably at least two important points to make. First, in terms of the run-of-the-mill Christians. So, I mean, as you know, I'm sure, Sam, like the three principal Christian communities in this period, so 6th, early 7th century in the Middle East, they're organized independently, but sort of the the theological justification for their distinctive identities is, as you know, Christological. So it's all about the debates that unfolded after the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon in the 5th century. And so then you have the formation of these three communities, the Chalcedonians, who follow the emperor, and they're referred to in Arabic sources as Melkites, and then the Miaphysites, and then the so-called Nestorians, or Church of the East. So those are the three principal communities. We could sort of set aside the Church of the East from this zone, although some people speculate maybe through the Persian influence they were around or something. But, you know, the Church of the East is really sort of Eastern Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and further east, you know, what is today Iran. But in the whole zone between, you know, sort of from Constantinople, circling down through, you know, the coast of what is now Turkey, all of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and then down to Nubia and Ethiopia, and the western zone of Arabia, you have this coexistence between the Melkites and the Miaphysites, or the Chalcedonians and the Miaphysites. And, you know, I'm not a real expert in this. David Bertaina of the University of Illinois has written some great things on this, but many scholars have. Sidney Griffith, Jack Tannous of Princeton University, and there are a number of European scholars who've done really good work on sort of these ecclesial communities at the time. In any case, I mean, the kind of the rule of thumb is that the mass of the people in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Arabia were Miaphysites, the mass of the people. So like the great majority of the people. But you do have important Melkite communities, principally but not exclusively in the urban areas. So, I mean, that seems to be the case for Arabia as well.
That they would have been in communion with Alexandria, basically, after Alexandria had split off from Constantinople at Chalcedon.
So, yes, I don't know very well. Like, were there two bishops at sometimes in Alexandria, Chalcedonian and the Miaphysite? I'm not sure, but yeah, definitely. So, like, you know, eventually, as you know, the Coptic Church emerges from this, which is even today, it's called Oriental Orthodox today, but it's Miaphysite. Same with the Ethiopians. Nubian Christianity kind of disappears. So even we know that, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail because it gets boring, but we know that the different Miaphysite bishops sent out, in fact, there was at least one bishop, believe his name was Theodore of Arabia, was designated specifically for the evangelization of Arabic speakers. And we know that in a special way, this political entity that was kind of a adjunct, that's the wrong word, to the Byzantine Empire, known as the Japhnids or the Ghassanids, which you can speak about them. You know, they had this very important king named al-Harith in the 6th century who reigned for like 40 years. We know he was Miaphysite, and basically all the areas he controlled were Miaphysite, and these are Arabic speakers. So that's kind of the first point. Miaphysites. I go on to the second point, but I spoke too long in the first point. Maybe you want to follow up or.
No, go ahead with your second point.
Okay, then the second point is, what about, you know, outside of the run-of-the-mill Christians? Like, do we have heretics, so-called heretics? Well, it depends on your perspective, but so-called heretics running around in Arabia. I mean, the first point is we have no documentary evidence, no inscriptions, no direct witness to any group existing in the 6th and early 7th centuries that departed wildly from one of those three communities. So, you know, all this speculation, there's a famous saying, I don't know if you're alluding to it before, Sam, there's a famous saying that Arabia is the womb of heresies. But like, we just don't have evidence of this. People want to find like something like an Arian Christian or some sort of Jewish Christian, Ebionite Christianity. We just don't have any evidence for that. Okay, but as Jack Tannous has mentioned in his masterful work, The Making of the Medieval Middle East, we need to keep in mind that even if there were perhaps no sort of organized communities of Arian or Ebionite or some other kind of Christians, like on the ground, Christians might believe all sorts of things. So do you know what I mean by that? Like a distinction must be made. The absence of formal sort of heretical or heterodox communities doesn't mean there weren't. I mean, even today, like, here in Indiana, if you ask a Christian down at the local church what they think about, Christ, one nature, two natures, stuff like that, did he have a human mind or just a divine mind? Who knows what kind of answer you're going to get. So anyway.
Yeah. So one thing that my channel focuses on is that sort of early development of Christology and Christian history. And I have noticed that the Christology that tends to think that Jesus it's not even Arian, like you could call it, sometimes called adoptionism, although I don't think that's exactly a very fair academic label, but the belief that Jesus is just a human being empowered by God was in the time of the 3rd and 4th century most common in the easternmost wing, right, kind of where Aramaic speakers interacted with Greek speakers. There's Beryllus of Bostra in sort of southeast Syria, although it was called he was called the Bishop of Arabia at the time. Paul of Samosata is from sort of southeastern Turkey. He then becomes the Bishop of Antioch and then gets in trouble for his sort of heretical views. And there is Aphrahat the Persian Sage, who was an important writer sort of in the middle of the 4th century, who seems to, if you read him closely, not be particularly orthodox in his Christology either. But yet at the same time, this is like 300 or 400 years earlier than the time that we're talking about. And a lot can change. It does, when you're looking at the 3rd and 4th century of Christianity, it does seem like there are these heretical ideas on the eastern fringe of the empire that occasionally penetrate into the Greco-Roman consciousness and cause a stir. But it would be quite something if they had been able to persist for, from say, 350 AD all the way to 500 or 600 AD.
Right. So it'll be really interesting, Sam, for you. I mentioned the name of a scholar from the University of Illinois. His name is David Bertaina. He's written a really landmark article in the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association, long name JIQSA, J-I-Q-S-A, on debates within the Miaphysite communities in the 6th and early 7th century. But generally, he knows that he knows that kind of just a slightly later period of time in the Eastern Middle East much better than I do. So he might be a great person to speak to about these things. The debate that was kind of causing trouble among the Miaphysites right at the dawn of Islam, it wasn't Christological per se. This is within the Miaphysites, but it was a movement associated with someone named John Philoponus, which is a so-called, their opponents called John and his followers tritheists. So there were debates about the Trinity and the question of essence in God. Now, at the same time, you constantly had, as I'm sure you know, efforts from different emperors had different ideas, but Heraclius in the 7th century, but others, Justinian in the 6th century, they had different sort of appeals to the Miaphysites to sort of come to common ground on Christology. So Christology question between the Melkites and the Miaphysites was definitely ongoing, but there was no question of as far as I know, in these debates, neither side was saying that, for example, Jesus was a holy man whom God adopted at the baptism. When Jesus was baptized, and so God, by proclaiming, "This is my beloved Son," it's like at that moment, with the baptism and the descent of the Holy Spirit, Jesus becomes a beloved Son by God's will or something, but not by his essence. We don't see that opinion in these kind of back and forth between Constantinople and the Miaphysites. Instead, they're just kind of fancy efforts to say, okay, the word nature has caused us trouble. Let's use the word will. I'm sure you probably heard of this debate. Christ having one will. Can we all agree on that? Yeah,
It turns out no.
Yeah,
Can't agree.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, it led to more trouble because of what
Mhm.
is today the Maronite Church kind of develops out of that debate, I think. So, I mean, there's a lot going on, and then there's a lot, I think, that went on that we simply don't know, because all we have, are the men of religion, the so-called elites. They're not always, rich guys. Some of them are poor monks, but they're still the educated elites. In the way they tell us these stories, but on the ground, as Jack Tannous says, is a whole nother story.
Sure. So while we don't have any evidence of any self-consciously defined heretical outcast Christian community that had been, exiled by some council or another earlier on and knew that we believe this even though they believe this, but still on the ground in Arabia, if you're relatively far away from these educated centers of Christianity where the highfalutin debates are happening, there might not be very thorough catechesis, and in the absence of that, all sorts of kind of creative and individual ideas might be sort of filling the blank. Absolutely. It might be something more like that than there are people who know they are heretics who are hiding there.
Yeah, totally agree. Maybe the only comment I would add to that is, I mean, as I'm sure you know, Sam, like, it's important to keep in mind that the Syriac Church is very sophisticated. I mean, anyone who's read Ephraim or Jacob of Serugh or Narsai or others know, like, there are efforts at catechesis, oftentimes in creative ways, through sort of metrical homilies, poetic hymns. So it's not like there weren't folks trying to catechize, but I think it's true that especially in a place, I mean, I assume, like, say, Central Arabia, it's hard to know on the ground what people were believing.
Yeah, sure. So now let's transition to Muhammad himself and then the emergence of the Quran. So would Muhammad have, growing up, felt like he was a Christian if Arabia seems so thoroughly evangelized by about 100 years prior to him sort of entering his prophethood? Does he think of himself as a Christian or growing up in a Christian culture?
There's no sign that he thought of himself as a Christian. I'm just going to open a blind here. Maybe I get a little more light because it looks like my face is. I don't know if that helps at all. Yeah, there's no sign that he thought of himself as a Christian, but there are signs within the Quran itself that he's worried about Christian missions. So there are a few verses which says something like, they will not be satisfied until you become a Jew or a Christian. Or there's a famous verse in Quran 29 in which God, through Muhammad, tells the Muslim believers, do not debate with the people of the book except in the best way. So sort of at issue here is the possibility of debating with Jews and Christians. The Arabic word is jadal or majadala. So, I mean, there are kind of hints in the Quran itself, even if you set aside the stone inscriptions, that not only are the Christians around, but the Christians are missionizing, and Muhammad was concerned with coming up with good answers to them.
So what sort of religious identity would Muhammad have grown up with? So if Arabia is relatively Christianized, but Muhammad himself seems to testify that not everyone's a Christian, but yet he's some sort of Abrahamic monotheist. What exactly is his identity if it's
right.
neither Jewish nor Christian nor pagan?
Well, I mean, I prefer the I don't know answer to even I'm not really comfortable with the fallback position that he grew up as some sort of monotheist, that neither Jew nor Christian. So I think what we can say is there's no sign in the Quran that he was a Christian. There's no sign in the later, either Islamic or non-Islamic sources that he was a Christian. Islamic tradition tells us that he came from a family of pagans, like all of the Meccans, but that he had this kind of instinctual sense of almost like a natural monotheism. So he avoided participation in pagan rites, sort of naturally. But these are much later sources, Sam. Like those stories, we just, they're not actually documentary evidence. So, there's a famous verse towards the end of the Quran in which God says to Muhammad, it's a little strange, right, as a historical source, because it's part of the Quran that's being proclaimed, but it's kind of an intimate dialogue in which God is speaking to Muhammad. God says to Muhammad, were you not basically wandering and we guided you? And so, Muslims would say, well, that just means we called you to prophethood.
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of reference, it could be a lot of things. It could be, hypothetically, it could be, were you not a Christian and then we guided you to start this new religion? It could be, were you not a pagan? As I said, I find it hard to believe that there was active pagan communities, even though the Quran has some allusions to pagan things. So anyway, it's very hard to know.
Sure. And so what awareness of Christianity does the Quran reveal that Muhammad seems to have had?
A lot,
And like what he seems to know quite a lot of stories, although some of these stories seem to be supplemented by what we would call the Apocrypha.
Exactly.
But there aren't like, big long New Testament quotations. And in fact, there's like entire, it seems like he might not have been aware of, say, the epistles of Paul basically at all, or something like that. Or maybe he was. And so how deep of awareness does he have of Christian theology, of Christian scriptures, and all those sorts of things?
Okay, so a great awareness of Christianity and of Christians.
Mm-hmm.
As for the Bible, that's another question. I think he probably didn't know the Bible well. But let's start with Christianity and Christians,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, Christianity is sort of everywhere in the Quran, everywhere, even in places where the word Christian or the name Jesus doesn't appear. But it's everywhere. So, as you mentioned, there are lots and lots of stories, not only from the Bible, but also from later Christian tradition. Jesus forming a bird from clay and bringing it to life with his breath. Christian stories that don't involve Jesus, like, the Christianized Alexander romance, where Alexander the Great becomes a proto-Christian. That's in the Quran. It's in chapter 18. So all sorts of stories. Then you also have biblical turns of phrase that are not really preserved within their biblical context. It might surprise some of your viewers, Sam, to hear that there's a reference to the camel and the eye of a needle in the Quran. Something really small in the Quran is called a mustard seed. So there's lots of that.
But it doesn't mention, say, the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, but it still has the idea of something small being a mustard seed.
Which is actually, in a sense, even more telling, because it shows that these phrases, again, it's not compelling proof, but it suggests that these phrases were just in common discourse. Like, it's a Christian culture where people referred to small things as mustard seeds because they had somewhere in their past, they remembered the phrase from the Bible, and they even used it outside of quoting that particular phrase or particular verse. And so that all makes sense, right? So then because it's in the air, Muhammad or whoever uses it in the Quran. And then you have an interest in Christians themselves. So there's a lot to be said here, just so very briefly, and then we can follow up if you want. But so you have references not only to Christianity in some vague sense as some idea out there, but to Christians on the ground. So the Quran itself speaks to Christians. Quran chapter 4, verse 171 begins, O people of the book, do not exaggerate in your religion. Directly, it's an imperative. And then it goes on to speak about Jesus. Indeed, Jesus, the son of Mary, was only the word of God. I'm paraphrasing here. Cast into Mary and a spirit from God, all of this. So you have these direct commands or demands made of Christians. Not only that, you have references to different Christian offices. So you have references to priests, to monks, to monasteries. And very intriguing, we could speak about that, the references to monasteries, some positive references to monks and monasteries. And then a final point, which you could speak about more about, just mentioned very briefly, is even places where Christianity is not mentioned explicitly, if you kind of think long enough about this or that passage, you can see it's in the background.
Yeah. Yeah. And so he seems to have mostly just kind of an oral and cultural awareness of Christianity, but not any sort of deep exposure to the scriptures or deep exposure to highly, detailed theological debates that might be occurring somewhere else. Like, it's sort of washing around. He seems to have had many interactions. The culture has sort of Jesus-like turns of phrases in it. And some of these myths, some of them biblical, some of them extra biblical, but all of them kind of a part of a general Christian milieu. But it's sort of an oral and cultural transmission to him, not anything more detailed than that.
Yes, I would generally agree with that assessment. That's probably a very likely scenario. Again, this is all clouded with a sort of with some sort of uncertainty. The one place where there may be particular uncertainty is, whether the prophet and his community only had sort of passing or superficial engagement with Christianity. I think it's possible that it was more thorough than that. Again, there's uncertainty around all of this because we just don't have detailed accounts. But I think we cannot rule out the possibility that Muhammad or people in his community were engaging in a very regular, what's a good adjective? There's some adjective out there. Regular, consistent, and a thorough manner with Christian thought and Christian arguments. In that, in some ways, the Quran is a response to this kind of sustained, serious engagement with Christianity, if that makes sense. And the reason why I like to specify that or make that a kind of caveat is because there is an old idea out there, which I actually find pretty interesting, that Muhammad, he never really got to know Christianity. If only he had known sort of real Christianity, or if only had known more about Christianity, then he would have become a Christian. But, poor guy, he was out in the margins, in the desert, all this, which is actually not the case. But in fact, I think quite the opposite is possible, that the Quran is kind of thoroughly a response to serious engagement with Christianity.
Sure. So now let's transition to, what does the Quran say about Jesus, and what does Muhammad and the early Muslim community seem to have believed about Jesus, and how is that similar and different from the Christian communities that they're interacting with? So I'll just pass it over to you, but I've heard that the Quran talks quite a bit about Jesus, and even a surprising amount about Mary.
Yeah, so it's actually not that much.
Yeah.
In terms of explicit references, it's actually not that much. I feel like there's kind of this move where people are like, "Oh, isn't it cool the Quran speaks about Jesus at all?" Because they assume that other people think, that the Quran has nothing to do with Jesus. So it's kind of like hey, open your eyes, the Quran speaks about Jesus. And then people love to say, oh, the Quran even speaks more about Mary than the New Testament does. And there's a whole chapter named after Mary. I mean, that's all sort of true. Sorry, the light is getting all messed up here. I'm at home, and it's very sunny out, which is unusual in Indiana in the winter. I mean,
sunny and cold. It's also shockingly cold today.
It was -3 this morning when I was driving around. Yeah, I mean, if it's okay if I just pause on that point a little bit, because it might seem like I'm contradicting myself, because I've just said that the Quran may be a response to really thorough, regular engagement with Christianity. I tend to think that's the case, but just in terms of explicit references to Jesus and to Mary, there's not actually that much. So, I mean, most of the Jesus materials in chapter 3 and 5, even then, it's a small portion. The Quran is 114 chapters. Granted, 3 and 5 are some of the longer chapters, but even then, it's a small portion of those two chapters, 3 and 5. And in terms of like the story of Jesus, his life, you just basically have his birth, a mention of a few miracles, then like polemical things he says against Christians, Jesus says against Christians, and then some sort of vague references to the end of his life. That's kind of it. I mean, there's almost like nothing of like what he actually did and said. If that makes sense. Like, I mean, if you read any of the four Gospels in the New Testament, you just have long discourses, narrative sequences in which the evangelist is speaking about what Jesus did in the Galilee or his visits to Jerusalem. None of that's in the Quran. Like the long discourses in the Gospel of John, for example, bread of life or true vine, all these long discourses, especially at the end, I guess it's chapters 13 to the end, that long sequence where he's in Jerusalem. There's none of that. Like there's actually very little on Jesus in the Quran. So that's important. There's also very little on Mary. I mean, people almost in a kind of gotcha kind of way like to say like, oh, haha, Quran actually has more about Mary than the Gospels do. I mean, there's not really
maybe
much
on
there.
a word count basis, but not on a detail basis.
I guess so, in terms of maybe the lines of Mary. I mean, if you count Mary's name, it's just because the Quran refers to Jesus as Jesus, son of Mary. But all we have on Mary are basically the two stories of Jesus's nativity. The first one, and this is chapters 3 and 19. The first one includes a very brief mention of Mary's own nativity, which obviously is not in the New Testament. That comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James. But it's just very little on Mary as well. A chapter happens to be named Mary. That's Islamic tradition. The Quran itself doesn't give titles to its chapters. Islamic tradition just happened to name chapter 19 Mary. So anyway, it's kind of a pet peeve. So sorry, I don't mean to waste.
No,
that's
really helpful.
Yeah. So there's actually very little, and what there is polemical, highly polemical. So that's eye-opening. Yeah. So I know you asked more about like what is the Quran?
No, well, so what are the polemics? What is it pushing back on with regards to Jesus?
Yeah. So terrific. I mean, the Quran's principal concern with Jesus is to show that he's on Muhammad's team. That's the principal concern. It's not clear that the Quran is really has a deep knowledge of different Christological positions among Christians. There's no references to Miaphysites or Melchites or anything like that. But the Quran's vision is centered on Muhammad. Everything is about Muhammad. And the whole point of the Quran is now a prophet has come to you. Muhammad is a prophet who's come to you. His teaching is the authoritative teaching that you should follow. Muhammad's, not Jesus's teaching, not Moses' teaching, not Abraham's teaching, or any other prophet. Muhammad now, obey God and obey his messenger. All of the prophets anticipate Muhammad, and this includes Jesus. So that, as I see it, is the starting point, and Christology must be adjusted accordingly, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So the Quran denies the title of son for Jesus. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Explicitly in Quran chapter 9, verse 30, there's a verse which says the Christians say that Christ is the Son of God. And then it ends with a polemical end. It says, that is their statement with their mouths. Subhanahu, glory to be God. May God fight them for the things they say, or something like that. Yeah, so it denies that.
So it's denying that seemingly because it, not liking the idea of associating someone that closely with God, and not liking the idea that God sort of begets and has children and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, the classical take on this is the Quran has a transcendent God, because not only does it not call Jesus Son of God, it also doesn't refer to humans generally as children of God or sons and daughters of God. That language is completely missing. And then you have specific verses which deny that God would have a walad. Now, the word son is ibn. So in that verse I alluded to earlier, Quran 9:30, it's ibn, which means son. And then you have this kind of a constellation of other passages which deny, without mentioning Jesus, just deny generally that God could have a walad. Walad is sometimes translated offspring. It can also mean son.
Mm-hmm.
So the Quran is really concerned with this. And it's hard to know, what lies behind that particular concern. People like to say, well, the Quran just believes in God's transcendence, has this, idea of the sublime deity. There is one verse in chapter 6, I believe, which says, how could God have a walad if he has no female partner?
Mm-hmm.
Implying maybe that the language is unbefitting of God, because if you say son, it would suggest that God has sexual relations with a female partner. So anyway, it's hard to know without more information, like,
Sure.
why is the language of son or offspring particularly problematic to the Quran, when in other ways there is language in which God is anthropomorphic, and God certainly is not transcendent in the Quran in the sense that he doesn't get involved with creation. He's always involved. So it's an interesting question. It could be that this is provoked by the encounter with Christians and as a way of creating some space or distance between Muhammad's teaching and Christian teaching.
Sure. But it affirms the virgin birth, but doesn't want to call Jesus the Son of God, or even imply that God has children. It slightly leaves open the question of, so who is Jesus's father?
Yes.
But
yeah. In the Quran, amazingly, Sam, that debate took place, presumably in the Quran's context, because there's a verse in Quran chapter 3, which says the model for Jesus is Adam, whom God created from dirt. Yeah. And there's a story Muslims tell about that verse, but if we just stick to that verse, it would suggest that the question you just asked was asked to Muhammad, and maybe after thinking, consulting, whatever, the answer the Quran gives is, wait, Adam also had no mother or father, and that's not a problem. We can deal with that, right? So therefore, that's the explanation for Jesus.
Interesting. You referenced a verse earlier that calls Jesus sort of the Word of God and a Spirit coming over Mary. Right. What exactly is that verse, and what does that sort of tell us about views of Jesus?
Right. So in two places, Quran chapter 3, verse 45, and in Quran chapter 4, verse 171, Jesus is described with this Arabic word kalima. So kalima in modern standard Arabic means word. It's a little bit different because Quran chapter 3, verse 45, this is the annunciation to Mary by angels in the plural, interestingly. Quran chapter 19, the annunciation is not done by angels in the plural. It's done by one individual spirit. But in chapter 3, it's angels. And they say, Inna Allaha yubashiruki bi kalimatin minhu. Indeed, God gives you good news. That word is interesting. Good news, probably the Arabic version of the Greek word for gospel, or euangelion, gives you good news of a word from him. And then in Quran chapter 4, verse 171, that same word appears in a different syntax. There, we find the Quran, the divine voice of the Quran says that Jesus is kalimatuhu alqaha ila Maryam. Jesus is God's kalima, God's word, which God threw or cast into Mary.
Interesting.
Oh, interesting, right? Like, if you run with the sort of literal sense of these Arabic words, it seems to have very deep, profound theological meaning. Like God has a word, kalimatuhu. So God has a word, and God threw it into Mary. I mean, it's not exactly what we found in the Gospel of Luke for Jesus' conception, but
and it's not that different from, say, an interpretation of what it could mean for the word became flesh, or something like that. It's connected to that idea, although the word doesn't seem like a person. It seems like a speaking power of God or something like that. But it comes into Mary, and that's just
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, totally. Yes. And
That's
then
fascinating.
in that latter verse, 4171, we also see Jesus described as ruhun minhu. Ruh related to the Hebrew word for breath and
Ruach.
wind,
Yeah.
exactly, and spirit. In Arabic, it's understood to mean spirit. So, and a spirit from God. It's also a
Uh-huh.
spirit from. That's like what? Because
Yeah.
spirit is not a usual way of describing, for obvious reasons, because Christians believe in the Holy Spirit. It's not a usual way to describe Jesus in early Christian language. So, I mean, what do you make of all that? And there's
Yeah.
other. I mean, I could complicate it further because there's other references in the Quran that complicate things even more.
Sure. What does the Quran have in terms of anti-Trinitarian verses and passages?
There's not a lot actually. So yeah. So we have in that verse we were just discussing, chapter 4, verse 171, kind of right in the middle of it, after describing Jesus as the word from the word of God cast into Mary and the spirit from God, it then says, in a very interesting polemical way, it says, وَلَا تَقُولُوا ثَلَاثَةً, and do not say three. لَا تَقُولُوا ثَلَاثَةً. I hope I'm not getting it wrong. خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. It is better for you. إِنَّمَا اللَّهَ إِلَهٌ وَاحِدٌ سُبْحَانَهُ أَنْ يَكُونَ لَهُ وَلَدٌ. So do not say three. It's better for you. Very interesting. Like, what does that mean? It's better for me. You're telling me what's better for me? It's better for you. Indeed, God is one God. He is more sublime or more glorious than a being who would have a son. Okay, so that's one reference. That's Quran 4, 171. And then you have a reference to Quran chapter 5, verse 73, in which it may not actually be a reference to the Trinity, but it's often taken that way. The Quran says, لَقَدْ كَفَرَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ ثَالِثُ ثَلَاثَةٍ. Those who say that God is thalithu thalatha, which means the third, maybe the third of three, have disbelieved.
Yeah.
Those two seem to be total, attacks on Christian belief, although the expression third of three is a difficult one. And then you have one final reference maybe to the Trinity in that same chapter 5, but in verse 116, which is a famous one because people have ideas about heresies in this context, in which the Quran says, God said to Jesus, quote, "Did you say to the people, take me and my mother as two gods apart from God?" Which could be a Trinity involving Allah, Mary, and Jesus. Yeah.
Although I've sometimes wondered about that verse, is it just sort of a polemic against sort of hyperveneration of Jesus and Mary or something like that?
Yeah, I'm with you.
If you walk into a Christian church and you see a big picture of Jesus and a big picture of Mary,
totally.
one could get the impression or have the impulse to criticize. It seems like your gods are God, Jesus, and Mary or something like that, without necessarily falsely understanding that to be the doctrine of the Trinity.
And many Muslim interpreters, both classical and modern, have followed that argument, Sam, that you just articulated. Yeah. So because we have already early Christian apologists saying, look, the Quran is wrong here. Muhammad didn't understand the Trinity. And the Muslim response to that apologetical argument is like, no, God is not actually affirming that this is what Christians believe. He's just, as you say, attacking the hyper veneration of Jesus and Mary, Mary in particular.
Yeah, interesting. So it seems like the general portrait of Quranic Christology, that Jesus is born of a virgin, but don't call him the Son of God. Think of it more like in a sense of Adam. But he's still a special human being, and this word being cast into Mary and a spirit coming down. I don't think that that's what the Quran believes about every human that was born. That seems to be exalted in specific language about Jesus, but he seems to be a prophet. We haven't discussed this, but the Quran calls Jesus the Messiah, although we could talk about what exactly maybe the Quran means by that. So you have this idea of sort of a special born, uniquely connected to God human prophet, but it doesn't seem like he pre-exists or that he's divine in any sort of, I don't know, classical Christian sense. He's like kind of a special created human or something like that.
Yeah, so I think that's all right, all correct. The only addition that I think it's important maybe to mention to that is, it's possible also to take a step back and to say, what kind of text is the Quran?
Sure.
You know what I mean? So, and I'm not great in regard to this question as concerns the Christian Gospels, but maybe just for comparison's sake, one could say, okay, if we take the Gospel of Luke, in the prologue of the Gospel of Luke, the author, mentions his concern for an orderly account. He's writing to this guy Theophilus, so we can sort of intuit some of his sort of methodology and goals in writing his text. It doesn't seem to be that the author of the Gospel of Luke was principally concerned in responding to certain Christological or theological debates. He wants to give an account of Jesus leading to his, suffering, death, and resurrection, and his glory, all this. Okay, so if we ask that same kind of question about the Quran, I mean, it's pretty clear the concern is not Christology.
Yeah.
It's also pretty clear that the Quran is sort of operating in a highly polemical sectarian context with monotheists, with Jews, and especially Christians. And the $1 million question is really about Muhammad. It's not really about Christ. It's really the claim that Muhammad is a prophet, which, is like a massive claim in late antiquity. There are a few figures that show up, as you probably know, like maybe Mani or some others who show up more or less claiming. But I mean, early 7th century, someone claiming to be a prophet in the line of, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, new revelation, demanding to be obeyed.
Claiming to supersede them in authority.
Sorry, go ahead.
Claiming to supersede them in authority.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So if that's the case, like if we step back and identify that as the principal concern of the Quran, then maybe we need to take, maybe with a grain of salt, some of the language about Jesus, because it's just kind of there, but doesn't mean that it's part of like a coherent, systematic articulation of a new Christological position. I mean, it's like if there were a transcript, maybe of our conversation today, Sam, but let's say of, a debate I had with my wife over whether, summer or winter is a better season. I'm probably all over the place, contradicting myself, trying to like step back something I said, and like, if someone had that transcript and that was circulated, they might make a lot of this or that statement, but, I don't want to reduce the Quran to something like that. Obviously, it's cherished by Muslims as a very word of God, and I respect that. But I do think as scholars, it's important to be cautious in thinking that we can get, we can go a long way by running with this or that phrase in the Quran.
Sure. And keeping in mind what its main focus is. But still claiming to be a prophet, defending your own prophethood and your own authority and your own connection to God, that frames how he thinks about himself, and also tells us a lot about what he thinks about the people that came before him. Right? He thinks Jesus was someone like him.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and there are really intriguing passages, Sam, just a couple, which show that the Jesus of the Quran, he just does not look like the fellow we meet in the Gospels. I mean, the most sensational example of this is chapter 61, verse 14 in the Quran. in which basically Jesus is presented as someone in a military conflict with his opponents. The apostles are described as, sort of his military unit, his platoon, and God sort of affirms that this community around Jesus, his sort of unit, they defeated their enemies. And the reason why this little story of Jesus is told in this verse, it's a longish verse too, which is interesting in Quran 61, but that's another question, I guess. But the reason why the story is told is because Muhammad is appealing. This verse is understood to be proclaimed in Medina, not in Mecca. So Medinan context, where there's war, constant war, basically, Muhammad and his opponents. Muhammad is appealing for his community to be, to stand up and fight and not be afraid, to be loyal to him, to trust in him, and to convince them that God has his back and they'll be victorious if they stick with him. So he tells this little story about Jesus and his opponents among the Israelites and how God made them. Anyway, the point is, like, that Jesus doesn't seem to be, the wandering preacher in Palestine.
Right. And that's not just some sort of spiritual metaphor for Jesus conquering spiritual enemies with his spiritual apostle forces or something like that. It's
So
much more of a literal military context.
Yeah, the verse begins, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, I think. I might be getting the beginning wrong. But you who believe, be kunu ansar Allah, be the ansar, the assistants or the auxiliaries of God. Kama qala Isa ibn Maryam ila al-hawariyin, as Jesus, the son of Mary, said to the apostles, very interesting word. Anyway, but we don't have to speak about it. Said to the apostles, who is my aid or auxiliary with God? And some of the Israelites believed and some didn't. And God supported those who believed and they became victorious. So, yeah, I mean, it's all sort of, it's an interesting verse because the frame is Muhammad and his followers. And the interior of the verse is this anecdote about Jesus and his followers and the promised and accomplished victory of Jesus is a sign that if only Muhammad's followers will stick with him, they also will be victorious.
Interesting. One more possible difference I want to ask you about between the Quranic Jesus and the New Testament Jesus is Jesus's crucifixion. I believe there's a passage in the Quran that basically says that, it was only made to appear to them or something that Jesus had been crucified. Do you want to talk about that verse and what that might possibly mean?
Yeah, terrific. So, I mean, famous verse, a verse which has given cause for many journal articles by Muslim or non-Muslim scholars trying to sort out what's going on there. I mean, the problem is it's just this one verse, basically. I mean, the larger passage is important, but Quran chapter 4, verse 157, as you say, seems to deny the crucifixion. The language is so ambiguous that you can keep writing journal articles about it. But like outside of that, there's nothing on Jesus's crucifixion or supposed crucifixion in the Quran. So the verse can either say someone else was made to look like Jesus, or it can say the event of the crucifixion was made to seem what it was not. It has to, I mean, it's a passive verb, and the implied subject of the passive verb can be a singular masculine subject or a singular kind of it. So neither masculine nor feminine subject. So the implied subject could be the crucifixion, it, or Jesus himself, he. And most of Islamic tradition takes it as he. And so Muslim interpreters tell the story of someone else who was physically changed into Jesus and crucified.
Whether Joseph of Arimathea, not Joseph, or who is the person who helped Jesus carry the cross. But anyway,
I mean, Simon of Cyrene. I mean, but Muslims usually don't identify Simon of Cyrene. They either go for Peter or for Judas. But there's this early Christian Docetist stuff would be Simon. Yeah.
And my friend Dr. Khalil Andani, he comes from a branch of Islam that interprets it as that Jesus was crucified, but that it was sort of falsely made to appear to the Jews that they had like triumphed over Jesus.
I think that's a
But
good interpretation. Yeah.
but Jesus really actually was voluntarily, it was part of God's plan or something like that,
Totally.
or
Yeah.
something. And so the
I think
appearance
that's
is
the
that,
best.
go ahead.
Sorry, I'm being rude and interrupting you.
No,
Forgive me.
please
Just
go
very
ahead.
briefly, and then I'll let you continue. Yeah, I think that position is the best we can do with the evidence of the Quran.
Uh-huh. So you like that position, that it was that it appeared to the Jews that they triumphed over him or something?
Exactly. That, he really was crucified. The Jews saw him die on the cross. They thought they were responsible for the crucifixion. But God, the Quran always says God is responsible for life and death. So it was all part of God's plan.
Yeah. So it's not actually a denial of the crucifixion. It's a denial of maybe Jewish claims of, oh, that Jesus wasn't so great. We showed him what was what, or something like that.
Yeah. And there's this very intense, obviously one has to be very sensitive and careful here, but there's a lot of polemics against the Israelites and the Jews. It's of a different quality than the polemics against the Christians in the Quran. It's much more, I want to choose my words carefully here, because, I want to respect Muslims who have really advocated against anti-Semitism, for Jewish-Muslim relations. So it's not fair to caricature the Quran, but it is of a different quality. And in this passage, for example, the Jews are made to boast of different things. And one of the things they boast of is that they crucified Jesus. So, it seems like that part of what's going on is just this presentation of Jewish boastfulness, and then the rejection of the claim of, regarding which they're boasting.
Interesting. So I guess sort of my final question for you is, how much of these views of Jesus are unique to Mohammed and unique to his own religious perspective and his teachings, or how much of this would he have picked up from the air around him? Because I know some people have suggested, well, maybe Muhammad was influenced by non-Trinitarian Christians or Jewish Christians or something like that. And it's easy to imagine those folks saying a lot of what Muhammad would say in the Quran, and that he's sort of picking up on that strain, or how much of it is that he has a new, unique religious perspective, and that this is his ideas coming out that are unique to him and his revelation.
So I think it's principally the latter. We don't have any signs in the Quran itself or in the evidence of the rock inscriptions of non-Trinitarian Christians of any sort in Arabia. Now, it is possible, again, just to return to something we spoke about earlier, Sam, it is possible that even if there were no formal community that had survived from the early Christian centuries, that just like on the ground, people had these beliefs, just like, you can meet today, even in, a church down the road here, you meet someone who would say, yeah, Trinity. Anyway, but the other thing to keep in mind is another place for me where caution is merited is the development of the Quranic text into its final form. And this is maybe for another conversation if it's interesting to your YouTube community here. But, I affirm Muhammad really existed. Muhammad's life is at the origin of the Quran. I think it's very difficult to affirm that the Quran is the very verbatim words of Muhammad, in part because it's so highly stylized. People didn't speak like this. And, I could speak more about that. So, it's very likely, in my opinion, that the Quran, began with Muhammad, and then you had, a community, presumably sort of thoughtful scribes concerned with the aesthetics and other elements of the Quran that edited it, redacted it. Possibly you had different sources, like person A was like, oh, we need to talk about this thing that happened with Muhammad. Person B said, I remember this statement connected to Muhammad. And so, the story may be a little bit more complicated. Sometimes it's very tempting to think of, Muhammad as, I don't know, there should be a good movie like Luke Skywalker or something, like someone doing everything on his own. But the story could be more complicated by beginning with Muhammad, and then a story we can't tell in detail, but other members of the community contributing to the development of the final form of the Quran. So that would complicate things a little bit.
Sure. Anything else you want to say before we close? Anything? Any bows you want to tie up or details you want to add in?
Well, thank you, Sam, for having me. And among the things that should be taken with a grain of salt are all of my ideas, because I'm doing my best, but they're always open to correction. So if folks in the comment section here, have responses, I'll be glad to see them.
Sure. Well, Gabriel, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this. I think that my audience will greatly have enjoyed this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam.
All right.